great to be here, and it is a privilege and a pleasure to be interviewing somebody that I have long admired. Paula went through some of his accomplishments. Might I add that another reason for hating him is that he's done all this by the age of 38, which is just absolutely disgraceful. Now, Diarmaid, as I'm sure you know, was responsible for prime mover in a wonderful series on RTE called What If on RTE Radio, which posited all kinds of scenarios and asked the question, what if this had happened as opposed to this happening? Yeah, some of the programs were a bit over the top, like the one, for example, where the premise was that as a result of inadequate regulation, that a rogue bank essentially drives the country to the brink of bankruptcy. I mean, completely over the top. You didn't actually get around to doing that one, did you? No, you didn't.
It's first on our new list.
Yeah, well, definitely. A new series is required. So let me start. I know it's not really a history question, or if it is a history question, it's a very, very recent history question. But you are a commentator. You've been a very courageous commentator in the past. So let me, on the day that's in it, we cannot avoid starting with a what-if question. What if regulation had been adequate? Someone had shouted, "Stop, Shawnee, stop!" And the lemmings in AIB in particular had, stayed away from the cliffs of Anglo. What if? Where would we be now?
We'd probably be facing difficulties rather than disaster. I think if you look at the situation in other countries at the moment where they're managing deficits and they're managing difficulties, but they're not necessarily anything on the scale that we're looking at the moment. Now, one of the things we used to do with the What If programme was to play archival clips. And I'd imagine what we would be doing is playing clips from 2 or 3 years ago. People defending the system as it was, suggesting that there was no need to interfere, and that was the key word, that we can't get involved. Things are moving along nicely. The market is doing its job. Don't touch it. Don't intervene. This is what's got us to where we are. And that was in 2006, 2007. So I'd imagine we'd be hearing some of those voices. We'd be hearing the confident voice of Sean Fitzpatrick as well, telling us about how to preside over a successful empire like his own. And the effort that's involved and the risks that are involved, and the reason why we should be admiring the entrepreneurial spirit and the risk takers and all that. And then we would be going back to studio and looking at the consequences of a failure to intervene. I think we would be looking at difficulties. I don't think the regulation issue would have solved everything, but we certainly wouldn't have anything on this scale, because you would have hoped there would have been enough balances and checks in place to ensure that just the enormity of the risks, of the arrogance and of the greed that was there just would not have been allowed. Now, this morning listening to the news, I was reminded of a quote that was attributed to Kevin O'Higgins at the outset of the Civil War, when he was talking about the new government being under siege from Republicans. And he said that we were standing amidst the ruins of one administration, with the foundations of another not yet built. And he referred to wild men screaming through the keyhole at the same time. And I thought of that this morning, about us all now standing in the midst of the ruins of Ireland, of the ruins of an administration, with the foundations of another not yet built. There may not be the wild men and women screaming through the keyhole to the same extent that there are in other countries, and that's perhaps a different question. But I can't imagine that we would be facing something as catastrophic as this if there was any sense of responsible intervention, and if there was any desire to embrace this notion of regulation. And I mean, we've all sorts of different versions of what constitutes regulation. Light touch regulation, heavy regulation, different types of controls. We didn't have anything at all. And it was quite clear, and you can see that even in the archival footage now, which will be, again, still fascinating in 50 or 60 years, of someone like Brian Cowan, when he was Minister for Finance, saying, I am not going there, I am not going to intervene in any way, because to do so would upset the balance and would cause panic and would cause the system as we know it to malfunction, to all of our detriment. So I'd imagine if we had more careful regulation, there would have been more caution about the ridiculous enterprises and the overbuilding and the shoddy building and the huge mistakes in planning. that have been repeated, mistakes of 30 or 40 years ago that have been multiplied and repeated in the last 10 years. I'd imagine there wouldn't have been the same crass irresponsibility and absolute venality to build for the sake of building and for the sake of the profits therein, and from the government's point of view, for the sake of the stamp duty, and to build so much out of that and to depend so much on that. So more intervention would have had consequences, not just for the 50 billion hole that we're looking at now, and it's difficult to absorb the enormity of what that means, and the 32% deficit or whatever it is now. It also would have had consequences for planning and for quality of life and for expectations, and of course for institutions that at one time in our history were regarded as cautious institutions. At one time in our history were regarded as institutions that could be trusted. So I think it would have had consequences for things well beyond the actual financial debt we're talking about now.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if this was a dream and the What If programme you're talking about was the reality, but unfortunately it's not the case. I'm going to stay with the headlines, but this is actually a history question, because today and indeed last week, if you discount the Red C poll and take the Examiner poll, the Irish Times poll, there's the prospect of an historic breakthrough for the Labour Party. The question, aside from the obvious Civil War divide, how did we as a country end up with two right-wing political parties between whom there isn't a tither of difference, basically, dominating our polity?
The Labour Party in 1918, as a party that at that stage was established for 6 years, made a crucial decision not to contest, or not to contest the election of 1918. Now, there was a fair degree of soul-searching within the Labour Party about that. There was a fair degree of intimidation going on as well about the idea that you have to step aside in the national interest. This issue in 1918, and this revolutionary issue, is about the national question, is about nationalism, is about the future of Ireland and its status as a republic. And you need to step aside. And we don't need the complication of social issues, and we don't need the added difficulty of issues, of bread and butter issues, effectively getting in the way of national issues. And Labour made that decision in 1918. Now, I'm not suggesting that that was the issue that was the most important decision that they made in the context of their failure to impact on the system the way they would have liked. But it was certainly a factor in it, because the election in 1918 was the most important election of that era because of the expanded electorate. The electorate in 1917 was only 700,000 in Ireland. It was 1.93 million in 1918. Women could vote for the first time, women over the age of 30. A younger generation could vote for the first time, and they had an opportunity to vote differently and to throw off some of their political inheritances. And Labour weren't there for that. They reappear in the election of 1922. They do very well. They field 18 candidates, 17 of them are elected. It did seem that they would be able to impinge on the political system. And what happens after that is really a question of them, A, getting dwarfed once again by the resumption of the national question and the Civil War, the ease in the 1920s with which a government can set an agenda around stability, around a fairly right-wing agenda in terms of the need to contain problems and so on, the ease with which they can employ the Red Scare to suggest that Labour socialism is an inherently un-Irish gospel. It doesn't suit our conditions, it doesn't suit our recovery, it doesn't suit the agenda that we need to have in place, which is a law and order and continuity and stability agenda. And that's not just an Irish phenomenon, there's international aspects to that question as well. And then the emergence of Labour, or the emergence of Fianna Fáil in the early 1930s, largely stealing Labour's clothes in many respects, with regard to having what was for its time in the early 1930s a fairly radical social agenda, in terms of a commitment to house building, a commitment to social justice, a commitment to more state intervention to begin some semblance of a welfare state. Labour gets caught there. Labour props up Fianna Fáil initially and then gets caught, I think, as a result of that stealing of the vote. And it was extraordinarily successful, because if you look at how Fianna Fáil build their support base, by the time we have the first modern opinion polls in the late 1960s, Fianna Fáil has managed, across the different sectors of Irish society and how they were defined in 3 different sectors according to wealth and income, Fianna Fáil has managed to get almost equal support from all of those different sectors, including the working class support, or including that vote that you might thought that you would think might have gone to Labour but didn't. So it was a question of Labour failing to respond as well to that challenge that was there in the 1930s, partly because they don't have the numbers to do it, partly because there's often conflict in Labour between an urban and a Labour wing, partly because they themselves, many of them come from a Republican background, a Republican socialist background perhaps, but the Republican side often dominates. So there's a whole host of factors to do with their own political inheritance, their own lack of organisational skills, but also the power of their opponents. And really what you had by the middle of the 1940s, I was looking at an editorial in the Bell over the summer. This is the magazine that was started by Sean O'Phelan in 1940 as an attempt to try and showcase new ideas about Ireland and fierce criticisms about Ireland as well. And one of the points he made in 1945 at the end of the Second World War is that both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael were indistinguishable from each other, not because they shared political ideas, but because neither of them had any political ideas at all. And he then went on to raise the question of, well, where are the alternative ideas? Are the alternative ideas in the Labour Party? And what had happened to the Labour Party at that stage? The Labour Party had split into two because of accusations that certain elements of the Labour Party were communistic, were too red. So they were still bedevilled by that at a time, and I think that's an important time at the end of the Second World War, because what's happening then after neutrality is that Ireland is facing into a post-war world where it's not going to be part of reconstruction, it's not going to be part of the new political dispensation in terms of, broadly speaking, Christian democratic governments or centre-left governments or even centre-right governments. It's going to carry on and perpetuate that system, and Labour doesn't feature there at all. Look at what's happening in Britain in 1945, where Churchill assumed that he had won the war and would then win the peace and win the election, and there's an extraordinary result in 1945 at the beginning of the welfare state in Britain, and the beginning of Labour being taken seriously as a party of government in the 1940s. We don't have the equivalent. The infrastructure for it isn't there. The ideology for it isn't there. And what we get then is another 15, 20 years of stagnation.
I want you to tell me a story, because you told the story in your TV series, and it's a microcosm of the false dawn, of the rise and fall, the rapid rise and fall of a radical alternative. I mean, this is very microcosmic, but I think it has wider implications. Tell us about the short political career of Jack Murphy. Why did he fail? Why was he never likely to succeed?
Jack Murphy was a socialist Republican who got involved in the unemployed protest committees and the 1950s activism in Dublin around the issue of unemployment and payment of unemployment relief and food subsidies and related issues. And Jack Murphy was a shop steward. He was a trade union activist. He was somebody who would not necessarily have been seen, even within those protest circles, as being, a likely figurehead or likely leader in waiting. But they made the decision in the 1950s to mobilise, to protest, and eventually to actually try and get somebody into the Dáil under this banner of the Unemployed Protest Committee. And this decision was made in 1957, and we were lucky enough to be able to interview Sam Nolan, who's still alive and well and hearty and sharp as a tack, and was able to tell us why he would have been unacceptable, even though he would have been a more likely leader, in terms of his prowess as a speaker and an organiser and everything else. He was unacceptable because he was a communist, and because in 1950s, Dublin in 1950s Ireland, that was the kiss of death politically. He would have been denounced in no uncertain terms in a way that probably would have made him unelectable. And the same accusation was being levelled against people like Tom Pearl in Dublin at the time. And I always like their response to that accusation of communism. If it's communism to protest for 3 meals a day, well, then we're all Reds in the Unemployed Protest Committee. But they fielded a candidate in the 1957 general election. Jack Murphy was elected. That was something of a surprise. He was running against Roddy Connolly, son of James, which gave it an added twist as well. What he found once he went into the Dáil was that he was completely powerless. He was on his own. There's a latter-day equivalent of it, though the politics are different. I remember when Roger Garland much to his own surprise and everybody else's surprise, was elected in the general election. I think it was 1989, and he found himself in Dáil Éireann. And the question was then, what do I do now? I'm a TD, but we don't have a party and we don't have a leader because we don't do leaders. And it was something of a similar situation. How can you make any blind bit of difference on your own in Dáil Éireann, where you are dependent on the goodwill of others to give you speaking time, to take you seriously, to share time for interventions and everything else. And he then decided that he was going to table a series of questions or ask a series of questions about food subsidies, about the issues that I mentioned. And he found that he couldn't get a hearing from them. He wasn't taken remotely seriously by the other political parties. And he was up against that system as it was then and still is today, where the Dáil is not a place to get things done or to change things. And it's very difficult to make your voice heard. So he embarked on a hunger strike, a short-lived hunger strike that other members of the Unemployed Protest Committee didn't agree with. They were divided on strategy. And eventually he was persuaded by John Charles McQuaid to leave politics and to get the hell out of the country. He discovered the power of John Charles McQuaid, as many involved in left-wing circles or politics did at that stage. He was put under enormous pressure. He was told that he was associated with the most dangerous man in Ireland. And that was, of course, Sam Nolan, as far as McQuaid was concerned. They're the words that McQuaid used. He was summoned up to the Archbishop's palace and told that he was being used and taken advantage of by communists and heathens, and that it would be better for himself and family if he emigrated. He went to Canada. He had 2 young daughters. He discovered when he left the Dáil that because of a difficulty with his stamps, he wasn't even entitled to unemployment assistance at that stage. Now, he came back to Ireland in the middle of the 1960s and resumed work as a carpenter. So he did come back to Ireland, and I visited his grave actually in the course of the filming of that. I think he died in 1982. And that was the rise and fall of Jack Murphy. And again, one of the difficulties, I suppose, with television history is that you're trying to illustrate large themes, and sometimes it's easier to illustrate them through the story of one particular individual. And I thought that told us an awful lot about Ireland in the 1950s, but also about the culture of protest, because there had been a precursor movement to Jack Murphy's Unemployed Protest Committee, which was the Dublin Unemployed Association, which emerged in 1954. And they were marching outside Leinster House. They sang to the tune of A Nation once again, Starvation once again. And many of them were beaten off the streets by the Gardaí on the grounds that we don't do street protests in Ireland. And again, there's interesting comparatives in terms of our contemporary attitude to protest and to mobilisation. But again, this was deemed to be inherently un-Irish, was deemed to be communistic, and was deemed to be something that was, threatening the natural order of things. And it was very, very difficult for them to do that. So they were surprised themselves, I think, in 1957, that they got somebody into the Dáil. But that was no guarantee of any kind of bringing about any kind of change.
Plus ça change. Now, we've seen an incredible erosion of trust in institutions in this country, the Roman Catholic Church, banks, political parties, even the Gardaí, in certain instances, are either suspect or discredited. It's hard to know who, other than the GAA, that we've actually got left to trust in this country. Could we, or are there historical precedents, let me put it that way, could we start to trust ourselves? Is there anything in the history of Ireland in the 20th century or since the establishment of the state, could we trust ourselves, reimagine, recreate an Ireland not dominated by an elite, or is that complete pie in the sky?
It's not complete pie in the sky. A measure of the difficulties in bringing that about, though, is the history of the last 100 years or the last 150 years. I remember reading the report of the Commission to inquire into emigration that sat from 1948 to 1954. And they were talking about the crisis of emigration itself and the huge desolation it caused and the sheer human traffic that left the country. 500,000 people in the 1950s alone. And one of the interesting observations in one of the minority reports in this government commission report was that if you took the typical Irish farmer alive in the 1950s who had been born in the 1890s or the 1880s even if they were of a good age, and think of everything that they had lived through. That they would have got the end of the land war, they would have got the huge political turmoil of the early 20th century, they would have lived through a war of independence and a civil war, they would have lived through 2 world wars, even though not directly as combatants, and they would have seen all of these extraordinary kind of political changes and eras of turmoil. And the point was made that they are not going to be radical about issues. And an awful lot of that generation found themselves by the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s exhausted in some way from political turmoil. And I thought that was an interesting observation about that particular generation. What you would have perhaps hoped then was that the next generation would fight their own revolution of a sort, that they would question the institutions that were trusted by that generation for very good reasons, that they wouldn't be applauding to the same extent this whole notion of our great achievement is our stability. And even up to relatively recently, there were foreign journalists coming over to Ireland and saying, things are getting bad here, but the one thing that Ireland has, which a lot of other democracies don't have, is stability. Political stability. The institutions are stable, and that was seen as a positive thing. But back in the 1950s, when there was and could have been an opportunity to completely transform the system, the political system, and force change, social and economic change, an awful lot of those who would propel change and might even propel revolution were not here. They were exiles, 500,000 of them. Most of those who were leaving were young. And again, there are unfortunate parallels with the modern era in terms of emigration, and that's the era we're heading into now. That is one of the reasons, perhaps, why there wasn't that same impetus there. One of the what-if questions we asked before, because it was a distinct possibility at the end of the Second World War, if Britain had imposed serious restrictions on the number of immigrants it was prepared to take in, including Irish immigrants, would things have been different at home? Could you have created a level of protest or a culture of opposition to the system as it was then that actually could have changed things or brought things about? And that didn't happen. Partly because of the turmoil people had lived through, partly because of the loss of so many young people who went on often to get involved in all sorts of political movements abroad, sometimes radical political movements as well. That was one of the reasons perhaps it didn't happen. Another difficulty was with the nature of the political system itself, and this is another strain of research or another aspect of our experience that I think gives us a clue as to why things don't change. The centralisation of authority and of power in Ireland is absolutely extraordinary. And often if you say to people, I want to talk to you about local government, they say, oh no, local government is deadly boring. But there's a clue within the story of local government and the structure of local government and its relationship with the centre of power partly as to why we are the way we are and why people do not see the political system as a vehicle for change. And that is the centralisation of power. People don't experience autonomy or control or any sense of community power at local level. They haven't done in this country for a long time because the powers that were available, for example, to local authorities were slowly but surely stripped away over the course of the Free State and into the Republic. People don't experience that at a community level. They don't associate activism at that local level with a change in that kind of centralised system. So aspiring towards greater equality and greater change, there are just some of the barriers that people are up against. And when you talk about, say, the Labour Party being on the verge of a breakthrough, yes and no. Yes, in the sense that, of course, it would be unprecedented for Labour to be the largest party in the country. But you've also got to be conscious of the degree to which they are committed to fundamentally changing the political system. And if you think about all the talking shops we have over the summer, and we do them very, very well, and I would always heap praise on those who organise summer schools and the festivals, but I was up at McGill Summer School this year, one of the few non-politicians who was up there, and I heard them all coming up and saying, isn't it great that we can speak here so openly and so frankly about how banjaxed our political system is? And they would express this great gratitude to the facilitators of those discussions, and then they would outline the serious deficiencies in the system. We can't do this, we can't do that, we can't talk about this, we can't speak openly and honestly, we can do it here. And Labour politicians were saying that as well. Now, are they committed to changing the system? Or are they going in on the basis that we can do better than that lot with what we have? That's the question.
I mean, you talked about centralisation, and you're absolutely right. There is a rampant centralisation in Ireland. I mean, if you look at the French system, contrast it with the French system, for example. But ironically, I mean, it's almost counterintuitive. Is that the very reason why we have such an extraordinary also amount of localism and parochialism in evidence in our politics and our politicians, where at a time of national crisis, you get politicians who are concentrated totally on local events and are threatening to bring down governments and so on and so forth on the basis of local issues.
And we demand that of them as the electorate. And the electorate is not innocent in all of this. And this is one of the difficulties about reforming that system. If you are to say to people, and this came up, remember, back in the 1950s and the 1960s, De Valera, for example, was completely opposed to proportional representation on the grounds that it could lead to unstable coalition governments, and that single-party government is the only strong and effective and stable government. So let's get rid of proportional representation. Fianna Fáil tried that twice. The Irish electorate rejected it, quite wisely, in terms of the scenarios that were being presented to them, particularly by the 1960s when television had arrived, and you could get political scientists coming out and saying, if proportional representation is abolished, Fianna Fáil will have a permanent 100-seat tally in the Dáil. They'll have a permanent overall majority, and that was used by the opposition. There was also a suggestion even around the time of the second referendum privately that Fine Gael and Labour might actually have to merge to try and counteract this threat. But when you asked people why they valued their proportional representation system, they said, because we have them where we want them. And we know that when they come looking for votes, they're not going to get their vote unless they do X, Y, and Z. So that's part of the problem as well, that the electorate has and continues to demand that level of access and to demand that they fix the potholes. And this has been going on for so long. Demands that the politicians do things. Look at how Bertie Ahern, who's the most successful example of localism, look at how he built his career. Bertie Ahern came into the Dáil in the landslide of 1977. He was somebody who was not expected to get that seat in 1977. What he did straight away was he set up a system that would ensure that he got the best out of that attitude and that sense of localism and that sense of being beholden to the local TD. Send a letter asking them what their concerns are. They will, reply. You will then send them a letter saying to them you're going to address them. You'll then send them a letter to remind them that you are addressing the issue that they wanted you to address. You'll then send them a letter to remind them that you fixed the problem that they wanted you to fix. You'll then send them another letter to remind them at election time, do you remember that problem I fixed for you? And there you have your 7
But you don't
letters.
pay for any of the stamps.
You don't pay for any of the stamps. But you also then have the electorate saying, well, look, at this politician is looking after us and is looking after local concerns. So I think the electorate have questions to answer there in terms of how they respond to that. And it's generally regarded as being political suicide in Ireland if you don't have clinics, if you don't do the constituency work and so on. So we have that system. Proportional representation is fair in all sorts of different ways. It's regarded as an oddity. I mean, in terms of the single transferable vote, it's only ourselves and Malta that have it. It is an international oddity, but it does breed this localism. And that idea, particularly now at times of crisis, where you want there to be debate about national issues, about national solutions. But what you're still going to be looking at come the next election is a series of local battles. And how much of that kind of national issue is actually going to be properly discussed and properly debated. It's a big problem, I think, in Ireland. And again, it was being addressed up at McGill, that we are just glorified constituency workers. But there's been so many political careers built on that, and so many political careers thriving on that, that they don't necessarily want to change it either. And if you have, there have been a series of attempts to suggest alternatives, and they've been blown down. Think of the controversy even initially that was aroused around the abolition of the dual mandate, the idea that a TD couldn't keep an eye on the county council. It's very difficult to bring around those changes. And the same, you'll have all sorts of debate now about a Lord Mayor of Dublin and about how much of a change that is, delivering power to the people at last. And then they won't have any money and they won't have any power.
This may seem like a where do babies come from question, but it's a where does policy come from question. I've seen you many days in the National Archive poring through government files, so presumably you must have some perspective of how policy is actually made and where it tends to come from. Does it come from civil servants? Does it come from politicians themselves? Does it come from pressure groups? Does it come from lobby groups? Does it come from NGOs? Does it come from a combination of the lot? Where does it come from?
It comes from a combination, but I mean, first and foremost, if you have an effective dynamic minister, policy comes from that minister. And policy is then
Donogh O'Malley,
worked on.
for example.
Well, I mean, Donogh O'Malley, I've often used Donogh O'Malley as an example of somebody who was putting it up to politicians to match their rhetoric with action. And he played a very clever game around the introduction of free secondary education when he basically said, catch me if you can. He went out and announced a policy decision. That wasn't a policy decision and hadn't been agreed by government. Jack Lynch was Minister for Finance at the time. Sean Lemass was the Taoiseach. Sean Lemass behaved like a father who was cross but still very fond of his son. Jack Lynch went ballistic on the grounds that this was utterly unaffordable and was unnecessary. But what was interesting from my point of view in terms of the files in the National Archives is that Donogh O'Malley, when he was justifying that intervention and justifying that decision, he said, we have to respond to not just needs, but to ideas. And this whole concept of the intellectual capacity to respond to ideas, which is lacking so much in modern day politics, this is an example of it. Now, the way he went about it, there was acute horrorism in it, in all sorts of ways. The right kind of cute horrorism, because he knew once he'd made that decision, and he was able then to furnish all these letters he got from the mammies of Ireland, as he put it himself, applauding him that their children would be able to have expectations that their generation never had. He knew he was home and dry. But in terms of policy, that was often, in retrospect, presented as Donogh trying to steal a march on Fine Gael because they were preparing an education document at the time. And they were preparing an education document at the time. But that was a decision made by a minister, which then had to be administered, which then had to, there's all sorts of administrative follow-up that has to be done by civil servants and so on. And then, of course, Donogh O'Malley died very young and very tragically in 1968. And Jack Lynch, at that stage, is Taoiseach. And it's still extraordinary for me to listen to Jack Lynch talking about Donogh O'Malley, because he said Donogh saw horizons that few of the rest of us dare to contemplate. And the question I wanted to ask was, why did so few politicians dare to contemplate those horizons? And I got the answer, or some of the answers, in the files for the 1950s, where Gerard Sweetman, this is in the second inter-party government, as a very cautious and conservative senior member of Fine Gael and finance person, said, we can't be setting long-term goals because there's the danger that they might not be realised. And he said 5-year plans are for socialist countries and communist countries. And this goes back to the policy thing. I mean, you can see the resistance to policy and to vision and to long-term policy enunciation and evaluation. But the people who are working on it most of the times are the civil servants. Civil servants are very, very powerful. They are the taskmasters of their bosses and of their political masters. But you can see how they can influence and how a particularly dynamic or strong-willed or very hard-working civil servant can influence policy. You see all sorts of drafts of policy and redrafts of policies and paragraphs being taken out and included. But in terms of policy being initiated by civil servants, that's why I suppose the whole Whittaker episode was so interesting. And the fact that his name was appended.
Is he an absolute exception?
He is, in the sense of his public profile and the fact that his name was attached to a particular document. Whittaker had to be very careful in the mid-1950s as to how he went about creating a public discourse about his ideas, because he was up against formidable opposition. He was appointed by Gerald Sweetman, which just shows you that politicians are capable of making wise decisions as well as decrying vision and long-term planning. But he had to be careful about how he presented that material. I mean, if you take administration, the journal up for the public service, which emerges in the 1950s, people had to be very cautious about writing in that, about revealing their true identity, because they were civil servants and they weren't supposed to go public with their views. This is supposed to be kind of internal. And Whittaker did some of that, published some of his ideas, and challenged some of his political masters in a kind of quite discreet way. What changed and why he was an exception and why things were so different, I suppose, was because his name was attached to this particular policy document, this programme for economic development in the late 1950s. And that raises the question, of course, of why it took a senior civil servant to come up with policy at that level, partly because of the dearth of political ideas from the ministers and within the political system. So civil servants have been crucial. We don't know enough about the civil service. I would love to read, in the fullness of time, a full history of the Irish civil service. Would it be possible to write it? You know, it would take an extraordinary research effort to write a history of the civil service. But, you know, the cliche about it being the permanent government is an important assertion, you know, about the influence that they can have. But, you know, ministers, if they want, and if they have the passion to do it, and if they have the preoccupation and the interest and the sense of, you know, urgency to do it, they can affect significant change. And I mean, look at the change Donogh O'Malley was able to effect with that single and quite simple announcement, and the way in which he phrased it, that this is a blot on the national conscience. The 17,500 kids leaving school every year at the age of 14, they're cut off from all of the benefits that further education brings. We are supposed to be a republic. This is unacceptable. Now, if we had somebody today who had that approach to politics in a powerful position or in a powerful ministry, who said we are doing this because it is the right thing to do, and wasn't being, you know, hemmed in by the likes of Jack Lynch as he was in the late 1960s, or whoever the contemporary Minister for Finance is, it's very difficult to do that in the modern era.
The generation of the 1920s, the generation that came to power in the 1920s, okay, I mean, they were conservative, they were hidebound, but, and you talked about cliches. The cliche, I think, is that the veterans of the War of Independence, that generation that came to power in the 1920s and continued on into the 30s, 40s, and some of them into the 50s, that they had a greater sense of citizenship, and that it all started to go pear-shaped in the 60s when Q-tourism took over, when the Crombie Brigade took over and all of that. Now, it's a cliche. Is it a gross oversimplification? Is there a grain of truth in it?
It's not a gross oversimplification. It's about power and it's about money. And there wasn't a huge amount of power or money available until the 1960s, you know, in terms of what individuals could do and the kind of empires that they could build and so on. It was regarded as a great sign of progress in Dublin, for example, in the 1960s, to see cranes all over the place, which was why they, you know, we had these extraordinary acts of cultural vandalism around the place as well. You know, you could knock down a row of Georgian buildings in the name of progress and development, because, you know, you're going to build something in its wake. So, you know,
and there was a symbolism associated with that as well.
Absolutely.
There was a Georgian.
These aren't our buildings, you know, so why would we be shedding any tears over them in an Irish Republic? It's not a gross simplification. I think what is a gross simplification is to say that the generation before that were conservative. They weren't all conservative. They were radical in many respects. They were radical in terms of what they felt they could do with politics.
You don't think that the Cumann Gael government of the 1920s was conservative?
You could say they were socially conservative. You know, they were products of their era. They were Victorian men, and they were men in power at that stage. They were conservative in that sense. But many of them had had a very radical phase of their career a few short years earlier. You know, and Ireland's War of Independence, in terms of a challenge to British imperialism, came at a very early stage. So they weren't necessarily a conservative generation in that sense. Power made them conservative. Pressures made them conservative. Killing and executions made them conservative from the 1920s onward. That generation, and they were young when they were fighting this war, it had a huge impact on them, and we shouldn't underestimate that. But there were also many radicals involved in Irish life and in politics as well, not necessarily as TDs. But I mean, there were people who were debating ideas. They didn't always get very far with them, but there were ideas, and fairly radical ideas, around foreign policy as to how you can present Ireland's place in the world, as to how you can conduct Anglo-Irish negotiations and relations, things that were important back then in terms of Ireland's status. Staying neutral in the war, in some respects, could be seen as a very brave and not a conservative decision. You can read these different ways now. But I mean, what you're getting in the 1960s is a growing sense of certainly expectation, and the idea that politics can now be used not just to perform public service, but also to make individuals wealthy. And there are very obvious examples of that, and I don't need to go into them. But this idea that the spirit that guides politicians, this sense of public service, this sense of public spirit, that is very true of the previous generation. And you can see it, and you can trace it through various archives and documents, in terms of their abhorrence of the notion of personal profit arising out of their involvement in politics. And they had what could now be seen through the prism of some of the venality we've learned about from politicians too. There seems to be quite a nobility attached to that. And they were genuine public servants. They could have done much better, pursuing their professions, a lot of them. And it's important to make that point, to think about the sacrifices that they made. But by the 1960s, that has changed. And, what goes on in terms of fundraising, that became a huge issue. And if you consider the great fear in Fianna Fáil in the late 1970s about Charles Haughey getting into power, one of the concerns was that Haughey would get access to the notebook of Des Hanovan, who had responsibility then for soliciting donations from wealthy individuals to fund the Fianna Fáil party. And Jack Lynch apparently used to have a look at this list when Des Hanovan would offer it to him, and if there was a name or two names on the list that he didn't like, or he thought there was something slightly shady associated with their activities, he'd ask for them to be removed and not to be solicited. And you have that going on behind the scenes. But you do have that sense then amongst another group in the late 1960s, no, in the early 1960s, I would say, actually, that this isn't just about public service, if it's about public service at all. This is actually about politics as a business. It's about politics as a way of using contacts to enhance your own personal wealth. I'm not saying they were all like that, and it's important that we don't make that sweeping generalization. But there is that sense that there is a completely different approach to the notion of public service and what constitutes public service. And sometimes it seems far too convenient that what constitutes public service in their eyes also seems to suit them and suit their pockets as well. And this is one of the jarring things, I suppose, that certain decisions are being presented as being in the national interest or in the interest of public service, where they are quite obviously allowing personal profit as well to be made. And it worked at local level as well. I think one of the reasons, and it's there from the 1960s, where you have such an abuse of the planning process, for example. And remember, there were investigations into both Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil councillors in the 1970s about inappropriate planning decisions and about conflict of interests. You had individuals setting themselves up as auctioneers to profit from decisions that they had been involved in making as county councillors in terms of rezoning in the 1970s. They were questioned by the fraud squad within the Guards. Files were sent to the Director of Public Prosecutions and so on. No prosecutions forthcoming. That is an example of how debased that system became for the 1960s. You could argue partly because so much of the power of councillors was stripped away that the few powers they kept were abused. And one of those powers, of course, lay in this whole question of rezoning and being able to overturn managerial decisions around development.
Okay, that brings me to the last question that I'm going to ask. I'm sure there are lots of questions that will be asked of you from the audience. But there is an argument that Ireland was never a proper colony, so therefore we're not a classic post-colonial society. It's become part of the revisionist debate. But without going down that particular side road, to what extent, whether we were or were not a colony in proper terms, to what extent have we exhibited, and you've touched on it in various places, have we exhibited all of the faults of a post-colonial society?
Such as? What kind of faults are you talking about?
Corruption.
Yeah. I don't
start with that and stop with that.
I don't think they're the preserve of post-colonial societies. I'm very wary of all of this theory. I'm very wary of post-colonial theory. I'm very wary of even the notion of revisionism, when you talk about that in the context of post-colonial theory or anything like that. As a historian, it's my job to seek the truth, okay? And I'm not saying that in a pious way. You look for the evidence that's there. You can talk about theory and you can write about the theory of societies and make extraordinary generalizations as a result of theory. That doesn't interest me because it doesn't get to the truth. It gets to this notion of collective attributes, collective personalities, collective traits, which I think you're on very dodgy ground when you begin making assertions like that. I do think that because of our experiences of foreign rule, British control, and then a war of independence and subsequently a civil war, that we were loath and reluctant, it seemed, to go about doing things fundamentally differently. That is definitely part of our colonial experience, or our experience of domination in that sense.
Self-destructive anti-authoritarianism?
But you see, this is another thing about anti-authoritarianism. Are we really anti-authoritarian in Ireland? You know, can we make that assertion about ourselves? And again, this is directly relevant to the present time as well. Where is the evidence that we are anti-authoritarian? You know, it used to be said that, you know, the Irish aren't obedient, that the Irish are radical, that they're quite wild in many respects. Again, it's very difficult to see a lot of evidence for that in more recent times. So I'm not interested in that notion that you can ascribe these particular traits to a country. What I am interested in is going into the archives and discovering why the caution was there, discovering why the unwillingness to do things differently was there. And again, that's how I would see my role as a researcher. Rather than theorising about these particular things, we do have to revisit our assumptions. That's a revisionism in itself. But I mean, every historian is supposed to be a revisionist, not in a propagandist way or a political way like that, but in a genuinely scholarly way, that we do have to question the assumptions. We do have to relook at things in the light of documentation as it becomes available. And when you talk about, you know, anti-authoritarian, when you talk about lack of obedience, when you talk about radicalism, you know, you can see twists and turns in relation to all of those various elements. I mean, obviously, you couldn't have had a relatively successful war of independence without an active participation by the people. And that involved a degree of activism and commitment to change and willingness to get involved and to make sacrifices and so on, and which is why that generation was so extraordinary. But at a later stage, you can't then ascribe to a whole generation from the 1920s, 30s and 40s that they were all hidebound conservative reactionaries, because that's not true either. It's a combination of all of these different things, depending sometimes on external circumstances, sometimes on, you know, internal circumstances as well. There's a line to be found in a description by Declan Kyberd about, you know, Irish people not obeying rules or convention. Even though they're presented as a very conventional people and a very obedient people, he said they remained fundamentally anarchic in their everyday behaviour. And there's a degree of truth in that in terms of people's social life or their drinking practices or their, you know, their refusal to toe the line. There's an outward convention that we have in Ireland, which seems to be very important. There is a generation who like to be quite Victorian, you know, at an early stage of the state's development. There's also
don't underestimate the level of anarchy in Victorian society.
But there's also no. But I mean, in terms, see, what I'm talking about really is in terms of at least a rhetorical commitment to prudence and even to prudery and even maybe to puritanicalism. You know, that there is that notion of convention, outward convention. It's very different than what actually goes on. But one of the most distasteful things I heard around this, and again it feeds into this notion of the post-colonial legacy, was that one of the reasons why there was such speculation and land grabbing going on in recent times was because the Irish were finally being allowed to aspire to a lifestyle that the Anglo-Irish had enjoyed and we had been deprived of at an early stage of our history. And the idea that successful Irish developers and businessmen buying up chunks of real estate in London, for example, was some form of revenge. And that got me thinking.
It's a variation of Michael Davitt's The Land for the People.
But
really,
it's one of these great historical ironies. And it brings us to where we are and links us to 100 years ago as a country that did fight a land war, where there was a successful land war fought. And it was probably the most important social revolution of that period, of what resulted in land ownership. Isn't that the true irony of our experience? That native class of landowners were replaced, who were detested and reviled, many of them, for all the right reasons. They were replaced by a native class of landowners who exercised their domination of land and property and speculation, probably in an even worse way than those wretched landlords of the 19th century. And there's a certain historical symmetry. It's a very sad one in many respects, given where we are now. But that essentially, for me, is one of the great ironies of the last 100 years. Now, does that fit some kind of model of post-colonial schizophrenia? You know, what is that about? I would be very wary of applying a theory to that. The only theory I would apply to that is the theory of greed, and that people abuse money and people abuse power. And that, of course, is not something that is unique to Ireland. We gorged on it because something that was unique to us, perhaps, and I shouldn't say we because I'm actually critical myself of people who say we. We were not all at it. It's one of those phrases I hate in the modern era. We were all at it. We were not all at it. Most people aspired towards owning their own family home, and a fairly modest home at that. And they're bunched in with these we who are doing these terrible things and illegal things and immoral things. But there is that kind of historical symmetry. Now, I'd be very wary of applying a kind of a theory to that. The gorging is going on perhaps within a certain elite because of the point I made earlier on about that bleak post-war vista and the lack of opportunity for individual and collective wealth and speculation and building wealth upon wealth. So when it came, there was no sense of proportion, there was no appetite for regulation, there was no sense of public spirit. And it is this idea now of our time has come, and we've been waited long enough for this, and we're going to get a revenge of some kind. I wouldn't apply a theory to that. I think you're really talking about basic corruption that can be applied to all sorts of different scenarios, in the same way that I'm wary of this constant phrase that we need to learn the lessons of history. We don't need to learn the lessons of history. Nobody learns the lessons of history. And you can apply that to any country anywhere in the world. And it's frequently asserted that we need to look back and learn those lessons. We're not going to learn those lessons. The only way you could be vaguely optimistic at the moment is if you saw a serious commitment to changing what is a corrupt system, what is an inefficient system, what is a system that doesn't work. And even on the basis of what's going on in America at the moment, I wouldn't be hugely optimistic about that. Obama would come in all guns blazing, as he did 2 years ago, and say, I am going to put manners on the bankers, I'm going to regulate them, they're not going to get away with what they did before. But then when you actually see what's being proposed, it's tame, it's too tame. And I suspect the same thing is going to happen here. And there's this idea that we will hang on, that we will wait, that we will cross our fingers. And again, that is a huge failing, because if you don't have the articulation, not just of what actually is going on at the moment and the truth of it and the scale of it, but if you don't have an articulation of how somebody is actually going to do something different to make sure it doesn't happen again, well then you couldn't be optimistic. So that's something I think we're still waiting for.
Okay, I'm sorry, this has been so fascinating. I have lost complete track of time. I haven't a clue how long we've been doing this, but I get a sense that yeah, I could go on asking questions all night. But I want to give you a chance to ask questions.